forward to. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. Have a little love in the room. I know a lot of Jews don't celebrate that. It seems to be a secular holiday, so you can't hear. Okay. So this is as loud as I can speak. I see better than I speak, and I see that there's still some tables and chairs that aren't completely occupied, but I actually think this projects pretty well. You cannot hear me in the back? Okay. So, all right, turns out one of the speakers wasn't turned on. So, great. Friday the 14th, Valentine's Day 2025. Things keep moving extremely quickly. And as I mentioned last week, this is sort of a rolling 4-week class where the topics are going to roll into each other. 2 housekeeping matters before we get started on this week's topic. One is, I don't know if anybody decided they want to volunteer for the Purim spiel. If they did, you can speak to me, you can speak to Natalie. Boris, I volunteer you already, so you're going to be on. You're going to be one of our performers at the Purim spiel. Anybody else? It helps if you're an octogenarian, but I said if you're not, or leave a note. But we're trying to get participation, so if you're shy, this might not be a perfect fit, but you're still welcome to speak with me afterwards. The other housekeeping matter is, even though we had some time for questions and answers, I know that there were still a few questions that have not been answered following last week's topic, and I promised that I would start this week by answering those. If you're not here, or your questions have already been answered, or they no longer seem relevant given that 7 days have passed, that's fine. If there are a couple of unanswered questions about Trump 2.0, I'm happy to take them. Okay. So, there still is a double down on what we talked about a little bit last week, whether it's, Mara Gaza or Gaza-Lago. People tried to backpedal what the president said about owning Gaza and taking Gaza, and he since met with King Abdullah of Jordan, who flew over and thought he would temper the enthusiasm, and the message still resonates. So I'm not going to dive into whether or not that's a solution for what we have been going through, not just since October 7th, 2023, but what Israel and we as the Jewish people have been going through for thousands of years, and most specifically since 1948, which was celebrating its 76th anniversary, 76th birthday last May. So I want to spend some time talking about the wars. I'm going to divide it into 3. One is the topic that gets discussed, I think, the most. Israel's 7 fronts and what those fronts are. My argument is there's a big front. The other is Israel's domestic situation. There are a lot of problems in Israel. And the third is sort of what we can do about it and what we can look forward to and what roles perhaps we can play in that process. So I want to start and finish with Israel's domestic situation, because I actually spoke in this synagogue and many other places about judicial reform, judicial overhaul, judicial wrecking ball. Depending on where you came out on this, this was the topic du jour for over 9 months in Israel. From the beginning of 2023, the new Knesset came in on December 29th, 2022. The first thing they did was try to overhaul the judiciary with a majority of 64 seats in a coalition among 120. So it wasn't a very narrow coalition, but it was relatively narrow. And it was also the 5th election held in Israel in 2 years. So as those of us remember, from the beginning of 2019 from April 2019 till November of 2022, Israel had 5 elections. And the results were razor thin. There was a very ambitious coalition that held together for about a year that was led by Naftali Bennett, and then when new Knesset sort of collapsed on itself, Yair Lapid was the caretaker prime minister until the next round of elections. And we can save the recriminations as to why who won and who lost for later. But what transpired was a country that was, without being dramatic, I'm going to say, at war with itself. I'm 60, I wasn't 60 then, I'm 60 now, but I've been following Israel very closely, politically, socially, culturally. I don't remember it being this severe. I don't remember having such a challenge going to a Shabbat dinner and being told that you need to tell us where you stand. Are you for or against? reform. And you can't not have an opinion, right? There was, neutrality was not an option. And the passions ran so deep. There were groups that were organized, there were conscientious objectors, elite fighter pilots and special forces soldiers who refused to do reserve duty because they were so against what seemed to be an existential constitutional crisis. And then October 7th changed all that. There's the expression, nothing sharpens the mind like the guillotine. So the country, the Jewish people, got this wake-up call to put everything else in perspective. How justices of the Supreme Court will get elected seemed a lot less important than how did this happen to us. And as I look around the room and try to think of seminal dates, I guess in your parents' generation it would have been December 7th, Pearl Harbor, maybe D-Day, 44. Pearl Harbor was June 6th, 44, December 7th, 41. More people remember those dates than actually when the war started, September 1st, 39, or where it ended in Europe on May 7th, 45, and in Japan, September 2nd. But your parents' generation remembered the day that will live in infamy, or D-Day. Your generation probably, if you grew up in the States or anywhere in the world really when Kennedy was shot. October 7th has become the most famous date in Jewish history. 9/11. You ask people, even in Israel, you go ask people, when was the state of Israel? So some will know, hey, 14th of May, what's the Independence Day? There are other dates that are important, the Yom Kippur War, they know it started Yom Kippur, but what date in the secular calendar, maybe they wouldn't know. Everybody knows October 7th. October 7th is like 9/11, it's its own brand. And the reason is because it was so unexpected. And it's been referred to often as the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And in terms of numbers, it was. And the shock, like 9/11, was compounded by the fact that nobody thought this could happen. And Israel was criminally unprepared from a military perspective, from a political perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, from a civil discourse perspective. Israel was so completely off guard, even more than the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War, towards the very end, they kind of anticipated. There were debates internally about, are they coming, are they not coming, and then what will the Americans do? Can we have a preemptive strike like we did in '67? And ultimately, how calamitous will the blow be to absorb? It turned out to be quite calamitous. Over the course of the Yom Kippur War, 2,800 Israeli soldiers were killed. Do you know how many Israeli civilians died during the Yom Kippur War? None. Zero. There weren't any. Here, there were almost all civilians. 1,200 civilians killed on October 7th. 253 civilians taken hostage. Most of them alive, not all of them. And then it wasn't just Gaza. It was Gaza, and then on October 8th, Hezbollah started fighting, firing rockets. Thousands, tens of thousands of rockets. There were 30,000 rockets fired from the north. 10,000 homes destroyed. 60,000 people displaced. You add that to the 75,000 people displaced in the south, you have 140,000 people who are no longer living in the homes they've been living in for years. People talk about the Syrian front, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria also was a flashpoint. Iraq, people talk about the 7 fronts, but the biggest front, where I would call, certainly geographically, the 8th front, was here, and on college campuses, and in the media. And the invectives that were hurled at not just Israel, but Jews, and how difficult it became. You read statistics how difficult it became to be a Jewish student on campus. I always enjoy speaking to this group. I have less experience speaking to high school students, but that's mostly what I've been doing since October 7th, high school students and some college students. Because it's very difficult to be a Jew on campus. It's very difficult to get enthusiastic about going to a campus in the future when you know there's an encampment on that campus, which makes it extraordinarily challenging to learn. The good news is most of those encampments are gone. There were 130 encampments across university and college campuses in North America, the United States, and Canada. Mile and moderately built, had an encampment there for months. And Montreal police was embarrassing. Montreal leadership was embarrassing. We underappreciate how lucky we are to live here in South Florida. This is not the real world. The real world is not this. My daughter doesn't have school today, so she's here celebrating President's Day weekend with us, but the big party will come later. But there's a squad car outside her school and all the Jewish day schools here. Here in the synagogue, the leadership from the mayors to the chiefs of police, all the way up to Tallahassee, governor's mansion, are extraordinarily Israel-friendly and Jew-friendly. That's not true in most places in the United States. It's certainly not true in most places in Canada. It hasn't been true for a very long time in Europe. And I feel, and here I can speak to everybody in the room, I feel like we got a hall pass for Jewish history. So you hear that well. We have somebody here who's over 100, so she probably does remember a pre-Holocaust world. Most of the rest of us don't. So since the late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way up until very recently, we were in a golden age. And I'm not being alarmist. I'm not saying that the golden age is over and we're going back to the 1930s. We're not. Right before I came here, I was speaking with some folks from APAC. We're having there's another lunch, which I'm obviously not at because I'm here. But APAC switched its model a few years ago. I'm not trying to be funny, it went from being a PAC to being a PAC. I mean, the acronyms are the same. It went from being a public affairs committee to a political action committee. And the big difference is that APAC gets involved in races. APAC spends money supporting pro-Israel candidates and defeating anti-Israel members of Congress, mostly in the House. We'll probably have some challenges in the Senate. And the impact has been transformational. 2 members of the squad were defeated in their primaries. For those of you who don't follow sort of American politics that closely, you have primaries before you have elections. But the districts have been carved out in such a way that fewer than 10% of the districts are ever competitive because they're either so deeply Democratic or so deeply Republican that nobody from the other party could win. I mean, the people in this county still think they're voting for Roosevelt. So a Republican could never win this county, and a Democrat could never win sort of counties in North Florida. But Florida is no longer a swing state, but it's not so lopsidedly Republican yet. Of the 28 members of Congress, 20 are Republican and 8 are Democrats because of the way they redistricted, because the governor and both it's a bicameral legislature as well, both the Florida House and both the Florida Senate are controlled by Republicans. Anyway, coming back to Israel, what does that mean for us? What that means is that Israel was completely caught with its pants down. And it got critical support when it needed it from the United States. We had a whole conversation about President Trump. President Biden is no longer president. He ran for re-election. He wanted to, and he did. And we know what happened, and that's from last week's speech. But Israel received, since October 7th, $23 billion of American assistance. $5 billion paid for, and $18 billion was aid. $3.8 billion was part of the supplemental. It's still a throwback to the Obama administration, which is now being renegotiated. And $14.3 billion in supplemental aid package. AIPAC doesn't deserve all the credit for that. It certainly deserves a lot of credit for that. That was our single #1 lobbying point for close to a year. And actually, the biggest challenge was getting it approved by the Republicans because it was attached to a Ukraine bill and other, it wasn't because the Republicans were less pro-Israel, but they were less inclined to lump it all together in a package. But that is a staggering amount of money that bought a mind-blowing amount of weaponry. When we applaud Israel's subsequent military successes, these were not domestically manufactured arms. Almost all of this was made here in the U.S. and shipped from American armament storage facilities to Israel. We had 5, 6, 7 cargo planes landing every day. There were some bunker buster bombs that we wanted and we didn't get when we wanted them. There was certainly some daylight between the Netanyahu and Biden administrations. There were big disagreements regarding bombing Hezbollah on October 11th. There was a movement to do that. And Galant, the foreign of the general staff on the column, they call it Hebrew. And they waited a long time. Hezbollah was not decimated until September of 2024. So about 11 months later. So for 11 additional months, even now, people are not so sure that they want to go back to their homes. And look, there's no right answer. If you look at where Israel was on October 8th, it needed to figure out how to get into Gaza. Now that threat from Hezbollah, right, that ring of fire that the Iranians strategically built around Israel seemed to work. Israel's maneuverability was severely compromised. So the goals of post-October 7 were kind of incompatible with themselves, right? We're going to destroy Hamas, and we're going to rescue the hostages, and we're going to make sure that Hamas is no longer a viable entity that can threaten Israel again. And this was the first time since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007 that third point was insisted upon. Because I'm not going to say that Hamas ever served the Israeli political purposes, but there's evidence. I mean, we've got Netanyahu saying more than once that the fact that we've got Hamas controlling Gaza, and we've got the PA controlling Judea and Samaria, I got no one to talk to. There can't be a comprehensive peace deal. They can't even get along with each other. And there was this perception that Hamas was sort of busy and getting fat and happy running Gaza, doing their smuggling, of course, with some corrupt officials, building their mansions and villas on the Mediterranean coast. Gaza wasn't rich, but it was a very livable place. There were pictures of resorts that were built, and people made a lot of money, mostly illegally. There were quite a few folks, all of whom affiliated with Hamas, who managed to build lives. All that is gone. But the price that Israel had to pay for moving from the ancient approach was what they call in Hebrew chesed kadesh, mobilon, cut the grass. So the weeds would sprout, you'd come in, and they came in several times, 2008, 2009, 2011, 2014. There were multiple incursions into Gaza following the murder of 3 Israeli hitchhikers, rocket fire, abduction of soldiers. There were always events that catalyzed Israeli response, but nothing that came close to October 7th. So for Israel knew that pretty much every building is booby-trapped. Every building. Just to give you a sense of how much, right? I mean, you may have read this before, but it's worth repeating. So if it's not every, over 50% of the buildings in Gaza were booby-trapped. Over 20% of the buildings in Gaza went down into the shafts. This network of tunnels that I mentioned last week is larger than the New York City subway system. Everybody's been to New York City, been on a subway, you've seen that map. It goes all the way up into the Bronx, all the way into Queens and Brooklyn. This is a massive enterprise. And it was built using billions of dollars that were designed to accomplish something else, to help seemingly extremely poor people have the sustained life. And instead, it wound up making Khaled Mashal and Ismail Haniyeh and some other plutocrats extraordinarily rich. People accused Israel of turning Gaza into an open-air prison. The reason Gaza was an open-air prison is because the Egyptians blocked their corridor. It's called the Philadelphia corridor. That's the southern border of Gaza. And refused to let them to leave. And many didn't want to leave, right? Many of them have been indoctrinated into thinking that they're one day away from reclaiming their rightful places back in Israel. Although almost all of them were born in Gaza. If you look at the numbers, right, maybe there are 2 million people in Gaza now. I don't know the exact numbers. I don't think anybody does. But when Israel is accused of genocide, during the period that since 1967, the Gaza and West Bank populations grew from collectively about 1 million to now over 5. So if Israel is guilty of genocide, they're really not very good at it. And genocide is the Holocaust. The genocide is Rwanda in Gaza and what has been going on in Gaza is the exact opposite of genocide. And I think that it's extremely important for those of you who know that the nonsense is nonsense. You need to also have the facts to combat it. So the fact that there are 5 times as many Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza now than there were 50 years ago, that's a very important point. The fact that you have a civilian to combatant ratio in urban warfare. This is urban warfare. It's usually 10 to 1. Here it's approximately 1 to 1. I mean, the Gaza Ministry of Health is completely unreliable, and fabricate whatever serves their interest on any given day. But according to Israeli intelligence estimates, there have been about 40,000 people in Gaza killed. And we believe that about 17 to 20,000 of those have been combatants, Hamas soldiers. 5,000 people will die of natural causes over the course of a year and a half in a population set of 2 million. And the other, 15 to 20,000 people were, civilians caught in the crossfire. Now, in contemporary warfare, that is an extremely small number. Just to give you a sense of perspective, when you think about it, it's more logical than it sounds at first blush. But if you go back to the 19th century, fewer than 5% of military casualties were civilian, because that's not how armies fought. Armies put on the red coats or the blue coats or the gray coats or the green coats. They went into a field and they fought each other. There weren't people living in cities who were getting caught in the crossfire. By the time we get to the early 20th century, that number goes from about 5 to 15. And by the time you get to World War II, that number was 65%. So that's about 65, 70%. So it's about 3 to 1, 4 to 1. More civilians than soldiers were killed in battle. And when you look at what happened in Mosul, when the Americans had to get rid of ISIS, that was urban warfare. But nobody covered it. If you think about what the press did in Gaza now, the New York Times, in the first 9 months of the conflict, had over 6,000 articles about what was going on in Gaza. They had maybe in the first 9 months, the whole Mosul thing took 9 months, that's why I'm using 9 months as an example, maybe 100 articles. I don't know if anybody even knows what Tigray is. Tigray is an opposition group to the Ethiopian government. There was a civil war in Ethiopia, 600,000 people were killed. Maybe got 50 articles over 9 months in the New York Times. And everybody's saying this is the biggest mass casualty event of the 21st century. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Even if you believe all the Gaza Ministry of Health numbers, again, all casualties are tragic. But look at the Syrian civil war, 600,000 casualties. Darfur, 300,000 casualties. I mentioned Ethiopia, Tigray, 600,000 casualties. Civilian casualties. Iraq, from 2003, 2011, 250,000 casualties. Again, these numbers are hard to pinpoint exactly, but those are the estimates. Yemen has had a civil war between the government and the Houthis now also, 300,000 casualties. So the press, by and large, has an agenda. I think it's incredibly important to know the facts, and that's the 8th front. The 8th front is the one that we're fighting right now. The 8th front is the war that we're fighting in the media. It's the thing that frustrates us the most. It's the thing that makes it most difficult for Jews to wear their Magen Davids or their chais or feel safe on college campuses or even in shopping malls or wearing a yarmulke. There is a level of self-consciousness today that did not exist 2-3 years ago. And by the way, if you go back 2-3 years ago, I remember reading reports from the AJC and ADL that anti-Semitism was on the rise. But they weren't firebombing synagogues from Melbourne to Montreal at the rate that they've been doing since. And the anti-Semitism has become normalized, on the left and on the right. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to pay attention to. I think that most people in this room would recognize that the insidious anti-Semitism on the left, whether it's at the Ivory Tower, Ivy League, college institutions, and the Middle Eastern political science departments, or Black Lives Matter, or intersectionality, where anti-Israel, queers for Palestine, people made the joke that's like chickens for KFC, and all, the feminist movement, shame on them, right? Me too, unless you're a Jew. But that is real, but so is right-wing anti-Semitism. That's real and needs to be called out as well. I mean, Kanye West is probably a very obvious, propagator of that, but he's so out there that it's easy to dismiss him as crazy. There are many other Nick Fuenteses, Kanye Wests, and people like that who are hopping on the bandwagon where anti-Semitism has been normalized. And their Twitter accounts and their Facebook pages and their other social media, they're able to generate a frenzy and copycat legitimate expressions of Jew hatred that would have been completely unacceptable 5-10 years ago. And that's a threat. I think that's a threat to the Jewish people. I think it's a threat to Western democracy. And I think there are people who are gleefully watching as, now we'll talk about Israel's domestic stuff, that finally we have a president who gets it. Finally we realize that what worked before doesn't work now. But if you notice the press conference, I watched this pretty closely. Prime Minister Netanyahu was uncomfortable with this massive overreach because he understood what it means for him at home. And let me take a deeper dive into what's going on in Israel right now. You have a government. Bibi has been prime minister for, if I do the math, probably about 18 years. He had served 3 years from 96 to 99. He then served from 2009 to 2021, and now again since 2023. So yeah, that math works out. This is the first government that he's ever led where there's nobody to his left. Nobody, right? He is the left bank of his own government. Always, he had an Ehud Barak or whether it was Tzipi Livni or other people who would, Moshe Kaplan. They were moderate parties. They weren't labor, although there was a labor Likud coalition for a brief period, and Barak was the defense minister. But there have been constellations of coalition partners where some were to the right, some were the same, but there was always someone sitting to his left. I mean, I'm thinking of a person, so you imagine a car, remember they used to have benches before all the cars now have bucket seats, and the steering wheel's in the middle, you got somebody on your left, somebody on your right, they're both trying to grab the wheel, but you can hold on firmly because they can balance each other out. You can say, wait a second, if you veer us too far to the left, we'll fall off a cliff and vice versa. So, and it's a fragile coalition, and he knows that. And he also knows a lot about the history of U.S.-Israel relationships, where you have these right-wingers who would try to push the envelope a little further. That's the next to Jordan Valley. That's the next to West Bank. That's the next to Judea and Samaria. And, the Americans, even pro-Israel presidents, Republicans, Reagan, Bush the father, Bush the son, were always being told that these right-wing crazies want me to do this stuff. And now, here comes Trump, and he's pushing even the right to the right, massively with these kinds of statements and doubling down on them. And Netanyahu is also an historian, and he knows that from Begin to Shamir to Ariel Sharon, and he himself many times would have to go to his constituents and say, look, I'd like to do this, but what's going to happen with the Americans? Right? But I told you what happened when Israel was thinking about bombing Hezbollah, going after Hezbollah on October 11th and not suffering the same fate as it suffered with Hamas in Gaza, having that preemptive strike, try to take out as many of those weapons as possible, as they later did in September of 2024. Dermer called Jake Sullivan, who was a national security advisor. Now, Ron's a smart guy. He grew up here. He's not a military mind per se. But that's what, they call in the Israeli army a shelat kickback. I don't know if you know what that means. It's like a kickback is a duffel bag. I don't know if you guys remember duffel bags, but I was amazed. In 1969, we were able to put a person on the moon. It took another 30 years till we figured out how to put wheels on suitcases. But it's like you get punished. You got to run around the base. And the question was, with or without my duffel bag? And then, the sergeant goes, they'll take the duffel bag, right? So he asked Jake Sullivan, would the Americans approve us going and hitting Hezbollah right now? And obviously the answer is no. Don't open up another front. So when Biden famously, right, when he was still a hero, he looks menacingly at the camera and said, don't. The perception was he was pointing a finger at the Iranians, and he was. He brought in the Ford, he brought in the Eisenhower to the Middle East. These are floating aircraft carriers, but they're Air Force bases on the water. You got 75 F-16s and F-15s on each of these. This is a very strong signal to the Iranians, a very strong signal to the Hezbollah militias, but it's also a very strong signal to Israel. Don't, and Israel did it. There were other arguments about Rafah and what Israel did, especially the whole claims of genocide, are mind-boggling. Think about this. They telegraphed their intentions by telling 1.1 million Gazans to go south, right, in terms of where they're going to start their incursion. They dropped 1.5 million leaflets. They sent 6 million text messages, made 6 million robotext, and probably people aren't dialing 6 million times, but warning people, advising people where to go as Israel sort of commenced its Gaza incursion. This military campaign, along with what happened in Lebanon, will be studied at West Point and other top academies for decades. It doesn't have, the immediate impact that the Six-Day War did, but if you think about what Israel was able to do in the Six-Day War, in this war, in the Yom Kippur War also, miraculous recoveries and with very effective results. But we're coming back to Bibi, so this is what the narrative always was between right-wing Israeli prime ministers and their base. I'd love to do it, but the Americans won't let me. Here, not only are the Americans letting you, they're kicking you to do it. And then you got even the UAE saying there's no better plan for Gaza. They're not saying we want the Trump plan, but they're basically saying come up with a better plan. The UAE, remember in the last class I mentioned how the whole Abraham Accord started because Israel was going to go annex the Jordan Valley. Here, Trump is essentially saying, we're taking Gaza, we're going to own it. And the Gazans will leave, they'll go wherever they're going to go, they'll have a nice time, and you know when they're coming back? Never. You're never coming back. You're done. You're out of here. But it's not so mind-blowing, right? I mean, the confiscation part of it is, and here a lot of Jews, a lot of Israelis are so gleeful. Great, finally. And by the way, America wanted to do it, it could do it. Nobody would stop the United States from taking Gaza. There isn't an effective military force. I don't know what signal that sends to the rest of the world. Obviously, the Israelis are happy that they have America on their side, but, what if they don't another day? And does that mean that, Switzerland or Austria could take over Liechtenstein, or France or Spain could take over Andorra, or France or Italy take over Monaco? There are a lot of little countries that, the same way Saddam Hussein wanted Kuwait in 1990, basically took it over. It took an international coalition to get it out. So, the big difference is that Gaza is not a sovereign state, and nobody wants it. It never was a sovereign state. When Egypt administered it from 1949 to 1967, it did not annex Gaza as Jordan did to the West Bank during the same period when it was under Jordanian administration. When the Camp David Accords were negotiated between Begin and Sadat wanted the Sinai, but he did not want Gaza. Remember, he had both, right? So if his territory was taken away from him, not only did he say, oh, it's okay, here's the Sinai, we'll let you keep Gaza. It's like, we are not touching Gaza. So it wasn't a tit for tat. It was, we're only going to take back the Sinai on condition that you figure out a different solution for Gaza. And it was a mess, and it's been a mess. It's been a mess for, quick math, 46 years. And is this the solution? I don't know. But do I think it's likely to happen? Probably not. Do I think it's got everybody's attention? Absolutely. And when Abdallah comes and says, okay, we'll take 2,000. 2,000 is a drop in the bucket, but that could be a rolling 2,000. And the Egyptians then said they're going to create a buffer on the Philadelphia corridor and close it down. That's an economic hit to Egypt because Egypt collected a lot of revenues from the smuggling and the corruption that took place through those tunnels under the Philadelphia corridor. But whatever revenues they were getting is also a blip compared to the $3 billion in aid that they're getting from the United States. So there's a credible threat to cut off that aid. Those borders are going to be effectively closed. Whatever you want to say about the Egyptians, if they want to do something, they're going to make it happen. They don't have to poll people and see what the population thinks. So the narrative is still very tough. and it's still tough in Israel. So now Bibi just got to wait and see what transpires. And what's interesting, and this ripples into next week's conversation, is if there's a signal we can just go and take Gaza, how's that any different than Putin taking Ukraine? Although today, Vice President Vance warned Putin that there could be some military retaliation if Russia does not come to the negotiation table. So this perception that Trump is going to be very Putin-friendly, it might be grandstanding. But I definitely believe they already had a conversation. Definitely there's going to be a meeting. I'm curious to know what I'm going to say next week. But whatever I'm going to say next week is going to be different than what I would say today. And if the lecture was a month from now, that would be the same, because things are moving so fast. And everybody is watching. Everybody's watching. The Russians are watching what's going on in the Middle East. We're watching what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. So is China. So is Iran. So is every country that is impacted in any way, shape, or form by the United States of America, which happens to be pretty much every country in the world. And in Israel, there is a feeling of euphoria that we have this unbelievable backing, but this idea of not going through with phase 2 of the hostage deal would not be popular in Israel. Over 70% of the Israeli population wants to see this deal go through to completion. But what that means is that Hamas gets to stay in whatever current version it's now in. Bibi would love a pretext not to go forward with phase 2, but that would, because he is very vulnerable politically. And Smotrich came out and said it. So Ben-Gvir, who has about 5 seats in the coalition, pulled out already. It was replaced with Gideon Saar's 4 seats, so the balance is pretty similar. But Smotrich said that he's going to pull out with his 9 seats. Together they have 14. But Smotrich said he's going to pull out with his 9 seats if they go through to phase 2, and then the coalition crumbles. There are new elections, and it's not clear that Bibi gets reelected. Up until very recently, it was absolutely clear that he would get reelected. But he's cut his teeth as being able to stand up to foreign leaders. And now what's he going to do? Finally, a foreign leader comes and says, not only are you doing everything you want, I'm actually agitating for more than you ever dreamt of. And how does he move off of that? And when Trump said there's going to be, to pay if all the hostages aren't released on Saturday, they said, okay, we'll go back to the original deal. But, if there are any contract lawyers in the room, once you breach a contract, you can't go back and say, okay, I want to comply with the previous version, right? If you reject an offer, then the offer is expired. So this is not going to be governed by a first-year law class. It's going to be governed by realpolitik. And I think the realpolitik is they're going to accept these 3 hostages. They're not going to go into Gaza. They're not going to breach the ceasefire. They're going to wait for phase 1 to work its way through. Even though they probably would have never signed that deal, but for Steve Witkoff going to the Middle East even before Trump was inaugurated and saying, President Trump wants you to do this deal. He does not want to come into office with this hanging over his head. And within 2 weeks, he just says, that's a terrible deal, all the hostages. I think the impact of the hostages that we had in the last go-around moved the needle. I don't know why anybody is surprised. I don't know why anybody expected the Hamas-held hostages to come back looking robust and as if nothing happened over the course of 17 months. But they looked horrible, and you'd expect them to. If anything, some of the other hostages who came by earlier, particularly the women, said, we would have looked that way had we been released a month earlier. In anticipation of their release, they were primed and pretty up, so to speak. So Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a quandary, and I think a lot of this is going to depend on what the other Arab countries do. Saudi Arabia is trying its level best and behave very nicely. They actually offered to host with an American presence, the ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, and what that accommodation is going to look like. But Pete Hegseth, who's the new Secretary of Defense, his first comments as Secretary were, I don't know strategically why he said that, or even if he has a strategy, but anybody who thinks that Ukraine and Russia are going back to their former boundaries is mistaken. It's wrong. I think that's going to move pretty quickly as well. So we'll talk about that more in the next class. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Egypt and Jordan are the ones to watch. And they have been, certainly Saudi Arabia and Jordan have already been allies of Israel. They proved it on April 13th, they proved it on October 1st, when the Iranians were firing missiles at Israel. They participated in the defense. They allowed Israeli planes to fly over their territory, both Jordan and Saudi Arabia, when Israel attacked Iran and also when Israel attacked Yemen. And that's what made the attack feasible. And by the way, that's a huge, huge game changer. If you look at a potential more lethal taking out of the Iranian nuclear facilities, if that happens, if Israel participates, being able to fly over Jordanian and Saudi airspace makes life a lot easier. And they know they've already taken out the anti-aircraft stuff. They took out the entire Syrian army. And if you don't think, by the way, this was before the election, when Assad sort of fled from Syria, Israel took advantage of the opportunity basically to also take all of the Golan Heights. They didn't annex it or anything, but the Golan Heights are very long. They go almost all the way to Damascus. So Israel took another 15 miles of it and destroyed the Syrian army. All their weapons, their chemical weapons, their chemical manufacturing facilities, their military manufacturing facilities. And nobody said a word. I think people were kind of happy because you have no idea who's going to take over this country. But whoever it is, or whoever they are, they're not going to have access to a pretty lethal arsenal that was also menacing and hanging over Israel's head. So a lot of people aren't flying to Israel. They don't want to go there. It's not safe. People aren't going back to their homes in the north and the south. Israel is safer today, perhaps, than it's ever been in its history. Israel is less vulnerable to attack today than it's ever been. The Iranians will not attack Israel. Even if it's some sort of death salvo as the regime is imploding upon itself, I don't see that happening. And there's no other actor in the region that really poses a credible military threat to Israel today. So go visit. But while you're still here, I think it's just important to know the narrative. I think that one of the biggest weapons being used against Israel and being used against Jews is what I call historicide. The murder of history, of our history. Taking away our claim to our patrimony. If you think about the definition of Zionism, right? It means there's Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. There's Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. There's Medinat Yisrael, the right of the Jewish people to establish a sovereignty in their ancestral homeland. And that's what Zionism, Israel, is all about. And when you claim that Israel is an apartheid state, that's nonsense. Yes, there are Arabs and Jews living there. Yes, Jews do have some privileges that Arabs don't enjoy. But apartheid, which is Afrikaans for apart, they're not apart. Half the nurses in Israel are Arab, a third of the doctors in Israel are Arab. 2/3 of the pharmacists in Israel are Arab. There's Arab representation in the police force, fire departments. They have separate school systems. There isn't real integration. It's certainly not apartheid. Colonialists? That's absolute nonsense, right? I mean, Jews put the in indigenous. There were Jews living in Israel continuously, even after all the expulsions. I don't think the Bukhara itself let everybody out, and the Romans certainly did it small numbers. But that has been the defining component of Jewish identity for 3,000 years, and for the past 2,000 years, a return to Zion. So if you think about, if you talk about Israel being a colonialist country, you're just essentially saying that Israel does not have a right to exist. There's no difference. You call Israel colonial, you could say that maybe it shouldn't have sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, and that's it. Israel got out of Gaza in 2005, and people forget that. 18 years before October 7th. The PA had it. There was one election on both sides, by the way. The PA never had another election either for Mahmoud Abbas. And then Hamas basically violently kicked out the PA. When I say violently, I mean dozens of people were butchered and murdered and thrown off buildings and had their throats slit. And, So that's what we're dealing with. So when people say apartheid, genocide, colonialism, that needs to be shut down quickly, because it's wrong. And if we stop knowing our own story, then we'll stop believing our own story, and then we'll stop being. So I think the strength of Israel and the strength of the Jewish people is appreciating how rich it is, how long it's been, and how imperative that we keep that top of mind. Now, all of you are here for a choice, right? You're doing other things on Valentine's Day, and hopefully your children and grandchildren are similarly engaged in whatever it is that keeps them connected. I'm saddened when I say, first of all, again, South Florida is very different. Canada also has a much higher than average day school participation when you look at Jewish communities around the world. But here in the United States, it's not great. It really isn't. And I have parents coming to me and say, talk to my kids. They think that the Palestinians in the right, they don't get where they go to school. And some people will say they go to some of the public schools, and there are public schools here, and I get that, right? Jewish education is expensive. There are philanthropists in the room, and you're helping to support Jewish education, whether it's day schools or summer camp. Keep doing it. I think it's a great return on our investment. But I understand that not everybody can afford it. But they told me they go to Pinecrest, or U School, or American Heritage, or Miami Country Day, or in Canada, I know the schools in Montreal a little bit better, LCC or St. George or whatever it is. That's unfortunate. And at that point, that's on you, the parents. That's on you, the parents. If you made a choice that you're going to spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year to give your children a private school education, you don't have to send them to a Jewish school, right? But then don't be surprised if they don't have a Jewish education, because they're not going to get a Jewish education in a non-Jewish school. So you made that choice when they were 6 or 10 or whatever, but then that choice has repercussions. So, and by the way, even if you do send them to a Jewish day school, now I feel like I'm talking to 30 and 40-year-olds, most of you have already raised your kids. I don't really want to still in the process. But then it's got to be visible at home too. The symbols doesn't mean everybody has to keep Shabbat, doesn't mean everybody has to go to synagogue or celebrate every single holiday, but enough symbols to remind them why this connectivity is so important. And that's why programs like Birthright and other initiatives that keep people connected, and this necessary intimacy between the state of Israel and the diaspora is, I think, one of the Jewish people's greatest assets. And we saw that. People talking about October 7th. They talk less about October 8th Jews, but there are a lot of October 8th Jews. I recognize a lot of people in the room who were sort of on board well before that, but what I'm referring to are people who were not previously engaged, were not previously motivated. And sometimes they were reminded by their neighbors who were hostile, and suddenly they feel like they're being targeted because they're Jewish. But a lot of them felt, you know what, that's okay. So for everybody who's concerned about maybe going out with their Magen David or their Chai, there are a lot of people going around with these pins. And there are a lot of people going around with these other, I'm desperately waiting to take this off. But I won't until, we have clarity on the fate of all the hostages. So that's, in my opinion, a critical part of the battle we're fighting. So I'm going to take questions in a second. Do I have a toothless troubadour? Come up here for a second. This is my toothless troubadour who's going to lead us in the song. Sing along, yeah. Tell them get up, everybody get up, sing along with it.
Oh. Your friend is
Good
sitting
job.
in white.
All right, now we'll take some questions. Yes, bro. I'll repeat the question. Thanks, Mike. So the question is, what's my take on Trump's ultimatum to let all the hostages go tomorrow by noon? So I talked about that a little bit. My take is that it certainly reminded Hamas that if they renege on this deal, there will be hell to pay. So they immediately came up, right? So I don't think it's going to happen. I think that when Hamas said, okay, we're going to abide by the terms of the original agreement, because of the national, it's not a consensus, but because of the national mood in Israel, that they want clarity on the hostages, and over 70% of the Israeli population would prefer to get back to people that we know and take big risks. We're releasing hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for 3 hostages. So if you look at it, it's a horrible trade, but you can't look at it quantitatively, right? If you look at it in terms of the national psyche, every one of these hostages has a name, every one of these hostages has a story, every one of these hostages has a family. 2 of the hostages that are being released tomorrow also have foreign citizenships. One is American, one is Russian. So there is, and yet, we traded 1,027 Palestinian prisoners for Gilad Shalit. One of those was Sinwar. So, is there another Sinwar among the people we're releasing? We don't know. What we do know is the people who are coming back. So therefore, I think that Israel is going to abide by the terms of phase 1 until all 33, there are 25 identified alive, and 8 bodies, which we haven't gotten bodies yet, but we will. Yes. Yes.
It's the same model that the U.S. has in Puerto Rico. Now, as far as two-state solution, it's dead. It's been 50 years. 4 times the Palestinians had opportunity to have one state with a one-state solution, Palestinian state. That is it. Now, what is the solution now, in your opinion? Another good question. That is the political atmosphere of Israel. Actually, Netanyahu, 3 weeks ago, was speaking against the Jordan government to refuse to join.
Okay.
Another trick question.
So, I'll answer the third question first. Who's going to win the hockey game? The question is, who's going to win the hockey game between Canada and the United States? The other one is about, I did notice, though, that there are no Canadian goalies this month. I read an article saying that fewer than 20% of the goalies in the NHL now are Canadian. So, maybe more goals should be scored. But the current Israeli political climate, Lapid and Gantz being offered, look, if Bibi really needed them, then maybe they would join. Like if there was something that had to be done, vis-a-vis anything that Bibi does that they would agree with, they're going to support it anyway. They're not. I mean, this government's not going to fall because of the left. This government's going to fall because of the right. The threat to this government is Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. The threat to this government is not whatever Lapid or Gantz will want to do until there are elections, and then obviously they're going to run against it. As far as the 2-state solution, your first question, do I have a solution to the dead 2-state solution? No, but I agree with you that the 2-state solution narrative is completely different. And the concept that the Palestinians rejected before Oslo of a Gaza first may actually be the approach. Now, I don't know if the Gaza first is, the Gaza Laga or whatever, but I do think that they're not going to be combined. Does the PA have a role in the reconstruction of Gaza? I think that Israel would endorse some sort of model whereby Gaza was independently run by a non-Hamas. The only difference in everybody agrees that Hamas should have no part of that. The only debate within Israel is whether or not the PA can be included in a constellation of other participants that would include the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and my personal opinion is that if that were an initiative, as odious as the PA is to some people, and I certainly buy into the fact that they don't believe in the state of Israel, and they don't like Jews, but if it meant normalization with Saudi Arabia and all the things I talked about in the last class, and how that could lead to really a peaceful paradigm with many other Muslim nations, I think that relative to other risks that Israel faces, that would be the most ominous. You got a question?
Could you talk about the
Oh, I think that answers it. David Friedman says a one-state solution, basically saying that we can't live side by side, and Gaza, that could be like a Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico wants to be part of it. Puerto Rico is happy for the most part. I do a lot of work in Puerto Rico. They have a debate whether they want to be a state or whether they want the status quo, but they're very happy being part of this American ecosystem. People in Gaza and the West Bank don't feel very happy. They don't want what the Puerto Ricans want, vis-a-vis. They don't see Israel the same way Puerto Ricans see the United States. Puerto Ricans want to vote in the United States, and they want to vote and they want to feel and be American. They have passports, but they can't vote. If you're an American living in Paris or Riyadh or Tel Aviv, you can vote in presidential elections, except if you live in San Juan. So it's a paradox, but it's cute. And Ambassador Friedman's a very smart guy, an effective lawyer, but it's not an apples to apples comparison by any means. Yes.
Well, thank you. Superb talk last week and this week.
Thank you.
Very short questions. One is, you emphasize, I think it's important that in Israel currently, Arabs and Israelis cohabit very well. And yet, you hardly ever read about that in the media, which I think is a positive. But just to go back, Saudi Arabia apparently still wants a two-state solution. Do you think that will be carry on as we go forward?
So, regarding the media, I think we talked about that, right? I mean, is there a bias? I don't know how you define bias, but there's certainly a disproportionate amount of scrutiny applied to Israel that no other country really gets. Regarding the Saudi Arabian insistence on a two-state solution, look, it's delicate, right? They don't really care about the Palestinians. In other words, to the extent that they're saying that, it's not because they're going to wake up in the morning and be happier Saudis because the Palestinians are able to vote for their own leadership. The Saudis can't vote for their own leadership, so it means something different. But they can't not say that, right? Because for them to be perceived as, throwing the Palestinians under the bus in exchange for whatever goodies, cookies, and lollipops that they would get in some sort of normalization deal, that would hit pretty hard at their ability to be the standard bearers for Islam. The defenders of the two holy mosques, right? There's competition there. It's not just Iran, it's the Turks and the Egyptians. There are a lot of countries that want to be the standard bearers for global Islam. To the extent that the Saudis have, and population-wise, they're by far the smallest. All those three other countries have close to 100 million people. Egypt has more. Saudi has fewer than 40. So the risk that they would run by embracing Israel without appearing to do something positive for the Palestinians is high. But would their leadership in a constellation of participants that would sort of figure out how to reconstitute Gaza following what's been going on for the past year and a half, would that be a substitute for this two-state solution? Plausibly, yes. And that's kind of where I think some optimists are hoping to go. So I think this one will be. Yeah.
Two quick questions. Why do people feel, yourself included, if you say anything good about the right wing, you have to add something to left wing? There's no equivalent in American politics of the Squad and the Freedom Coalition, the uniformly pro-Israel. So that's the first question. The second is a Canadian question. What's Mark Carney's role? I don't know anything about his position to Israel. I know
We're
here.
both sides. So the first question is, why do I have to say something good about the left? I say something good about the right. I don't know that I said that. I think that it's important, though, to acknowledge that we have opportunities on both sides of the aisle, but most importantly in the middle. I think the folks are focused on, how do we placate people who marched in Charlottesville, or, the Proud Boys, or the Oath Keepers, and what do we do with the Squad and Black Lives Matter. I don't think too much about them. I think mostly about people who are in the middle, but just aren't focused on these issues. And maybe Mark Carney's one of those people. I mean, he was the governor of the Central Bank of Canada, then he was the governor of the Central Bank of England. Obviously, an effective economist who decided to try his hand in politics, and now he's up in leadership of the Liberal Party. I mean, I don't vote in Canada, but if I read the political tea leaves, it doesn't really matter, because I don't think whether it's him or Freeland or whoever's vying for the Liberal mantle after Trudeau leaves, I don't think they're going to win. I think the Tories are going to, they're polling very well, and as I mentioned in the last class, even though this whole tariff threat engendered a sense of Canadian nationalism, I don't think that's going to help the Liberals get elected. I think the general sense in Canada, and not just within the Jewish communities, it's not a terrible time to change horses. Yeah, well, and then you, sorry. Is there a question? I mean, we talked a lot about this. What's the question?
I can't hear.
But I'm sorry, ma'am, I'd like to hear a question.
So the question is, being what it is today, okay, how are we to, because you have to consider that there's two sides, and the two sides have to want something. And the side that we are, again, facing.
Okay, I'm going to interpret the question here. I'm sorry. I don't want, I can barely hear you. You're sitting all the way in the end. I'm going to be asked to answer your question, but that's okay. The question I understand it is that we've gotten to a point where the two-state solution is not viable. No, I want to hear a question. You want to ask a question, I want to hear a question. Why don't you come up here, and then I'll take a couple of other questions, and we'll get to you next. Yeah.
But there's a cancer against peace in the world. We got Biden, we do anything about it, looks like Trump's not doing anything about it.
Oh, what in the world, sorry?
But,
Oh, Qatar, yeah.
yeah, I mean,
That's
it's,
a big-
we're billions of dollars being spent in America against our interests and his interests, and no one seems to think.
So the question is, Qatar is a cancer, and it hasn't been excised. I can tell you from my own personal experience, I gave you an APAC anecdote where I started. I've had conversations with members of Congress who are extremely pro-Israel, not Jewish, but very pro-Israel, Republicans and Democrats. And I bring that question up, and they go, "Lenny, Qatar is an ally of the United States." Okay, I don't agree with them, and I agree with you. And I do think that there is now a movement. Remember, Qatar was kicked out of the GCC, the Gulf Coalition Council, and then reinstated because the Saudis and the Bahrainis and Emiratis agree with you too. They've been playing both sides. They're extremely rich. They're a very small country, but have a disproportionate amount of natural gas, and they're strategically located where they can liquefy that and ship it all over the world. They're by far the biggest supporters, not just of Hamas, but Muslim Brotherhood movements around the country, around the world. We're going to talk about Qatar and Turkey. I put Turkey and Qatar. Turkey is probably, if you say, what's the one to watch? You follow sports with your college athletes or the draft coming up. Turkey, I think, is the country worth watching. So the title of next week's talk is Russia, Ukraine, but we'll touch upon this too. We have a big Air Force base in Qatar. So there are American assets, but look, it would cost several $1 billion to take down that Air Force base and move it to Bahrain or move it to, one of the Emirates. It's doable. If you don't want to do it, right? You just built it. Why? You didn't just build it, but it's functional. It's there. It does give us some influence with the Qataris. But if your question is, are there cards that the U.S. could have played vis-a-vis Qatar that it hasn't played yet? Absolutely. But I think we'll get there, because I think that the people who are going to be making those decisions, whether it's the president, vice president, Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, Mike Waltz, National Security Council, you know, Waltz, Rubio, they understand this. Yes.
With regard to the American college campuses, is it your opinion that when things settle down, war, God willing, be over, hostages return, that the anti-Semitic situation, accusations, situation that we're seeing on the college campuses will sort of mellow out? Or
I hope so. I mean,
something more needs to be done?
so the answer is, you know, yes to both questions, but qualified yeses. The question is, do I think that when things settle down a little bit, will there also be an abatement of the hostility that we've been seeing fester on college campuses, particularly in the United States and Canada? And either way, you know, does more have to be done? So the answer, I think, is a qualified yes to both. I do think, I'm noticing this year there's less hostile rhetoric. There's still some craziness that's going on. You know, we hosted a member of Congress at our home yesterday, and the conversation was about Columbia. And Avi Feldman, who's a business professor at Columbia, just resigned because Columbia was supposed to make gestures towards fixing what was one of the worst, most offensive atmospheres on college campuses. And they just had Joseph Mossad, who was exhilarated after October 7th. So it's bad enough that he continues to teach, bad enough that he continues to teach at Columbia, and he's now teaching a class on Israel. So at that point, it turns the antagonism into a joke. And when you get that silly, people realize that. And I think what college campuses are now realizing, this is a big, big thing that people don't talk about, but I think it's a gift to Israel. Everybody talks about the atmosphere for students, right? My parents are professors, so maybe I'm a little more sensitive to this than other people would be. But it's very unpleasant to be a faculty member. And if you're a faculty member, you also don't have that window, 2 years from now that I graduate, I'm out of here, I'm taking my mortarboard, throwing it up. This is where I live, this is where I work, this is where I earn a living, this is how I feed my family. I don't want to do it here. And for decades, Israel has been lamenting the brain drain, where people would go, you can't get hired on an Israeli campus to be a professor unless you do a postdoc, and you got to do your postdoc in the States or Europe or wherever you go. But once you go, you don't want to leave. It's kind of nice to be at MIT. It's kind of nice to be at Penn. It's kind of nice to be at Columbia or UF or whatever. Many of those places are not nice to be anymore. And you are seeing many Israeli faculty who want to go back. And they're asking folks at Ben Gurion University and the Technion, Hebrew University in Bar Ilan, you know, I never thought I'd say this, but, you know, can I have my old job back? Or are there any job openings that I can apply for? So, and also students, right? I mean, if you have a student who's now a high school junior or senior, they're probably still on their path to going to wherever they want to go, Cornell, Vanderbilt, some place, Penn. But her age, they're going to, every year we go to Israel, she goes to summer camp, but we also visit a college campus. So 2 years ago, we were at Tel Aviv University. Last year, we were at Weichman, IDC. This year, she doesn't know this year, we're going to Ben Gurion University. There's a woman there who does, you know, space rockets and programs for girls and stuff. But, and there are other parents who are doing the same thing. Why? So that when her matrix of choices become relevant and actionable in 5, 6, 10 years from now, that'll be one of the candidates. Doesn't mean all kids from here can graduate from Poznan, Hillel, or Herzliya and go to study in Israel. But I think that's going to be a wake-up call for colleges. So the answer is, it's less severe now than it was a year ago. There are fewer encampments in the 24-25 academic year than there were in the 23-24 academic year. I think that some of the universities and colleges have realized how disruptive it is. I mentioned the encampments at McGill and how unpleasant it was to walk there. It's not as bad this year. I think the cold helps, the cold and the snow. And even Harvard, you know, where I went to law school, they had 18 gates to Harvard, and during this, they didn't quite have the encampments, but only 4 gates were open. And the school doesn't want to function that way. And you think it's untenable for a month or 2, and maybe you can hold your nose. But once it's a year or 2, then the administration, the faculty, quietly, right? You don't want to make too much noise, but quietly makes those readjustments. And when the Colombians of the world continue to lose the Avi Feldmans of the world, and replace them with the Joseph Mossads of the world, that's a bad trade. And at that point, they're going to realize that they're paying a price for that too. So that's qualified as your first question. Your second question, just talking about it and just pointing out the hypocrisy of that, kind of nonsense. There's hypocrisy all over the world. I don't know if you guys followed what happened in Yemen, where the Houthis took 8, United Nations members hostage. And Antonio Guterres says, we're suspending all aid to Yemen. All aid to Yemen. Okay, great. What were you saying, why should the collective suffer because of a couple of bad actors, right? I mean, what a different perspective on what happened in Yemen and what happened in Gaza. So there's hypocrisy on college campuses. There's certainly hypocrisy in the United Nations. You got to call it out, and we have good people calling it out. I don't know where you get your news from, but I'm really pleased that there are folks from Michael Oren and Barry Weiss and Ben Shapiro, and there's a Brett Stevens. There's a very formidable representation of thought leaders who are calling balls and strikes very effectively on our behalf. Yes, you and then come back to the question. Yes.
The Trump's anti-war war would help mitigating this.
I do. I think the question is, I think Trump's anti-woke war is going to help mitigate. Yeah, I think that this is not an endorsement of Trump or an indictment of wokeism, but I think that it depends how you define wokeism. Wokeism could be being more aware of what's going on in the world, caring. There's nothing wrong with being progressive. There are many rights that have been under-acknowledged. But this whole intersectionality, where if you're going to be a feminist, if you're going to be in favor of gay rights, then you have to be anti-Israel, and you have to be pro-Palestinian. And if you want to keep getting federal funding, you can still make your campuses hostile environments for Jews. That kind of has to end, right? And what's going to end it? Money. Right, Title VI basically allows you, the federal government, to give a college or university money. But if you're violating Title VI, which now it does include preventing a hostile environment on campus for a section of students based on, and their religion is one of them, you're not going to get your money. And by saying that the encampments were not being able to call out cries for genocide as being anti-Semitic, well, suddenly people are going to start paying attention. So that is part of this crusade, and I think that's, I think people are starting to listen. And that goes back to your question before. You and me, yeah.
Okay, first I'd like to voice the fact that I think we are all Jews. I think that we are all entitled to ask questions, even though they may seem controversial, and they may open up food for thought to a different opinion, okay? So, my question is the following. Why is some people in the West, a lot of people in the world, trying to impose that this is a territorial solution, that the Palestinians and Hamas, what they're seeking is a two-state solution, when they have not been open to this in the past. And to add two parts. The second part is, we offered a two-state solution when we did not know that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tunnels waiting to destroy Israel.
What's your question?
How do we achieve this humanitarian goal, which she's doing a
Okay, can I summarize? Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I'm sorry. If you have any more questions, I'll answer them. I'll answer them privately. I'm sorry. I've never done this before. You're making it very difficult. I've never had somebody who's not willing to just ask a question. The good news is I saved you pretty much for the end. I do have 5 minutes. If you have any more questions, come up and ask me. No?
Mark.